mali yake na familia yake, unless ukue rais for 100 years ndio utapata mali yao hapo nayo.
And you see, the president arrogantly told us the land his family owns was bought on a buyer-seller agreement.
This is a historical fact. It is documented. The Kenyatta family ended up owning 500,000 acres of land.
The earliest lands recorded to have been lawfully but rather cheaply acquired by Mzee Jomo Kenyatta was 3,865 acres in Nairobi and Ruiru that he bought for 472,740 Kenyan shillings. That is about 122 Kenyan shillings per acre then, which is about 41,000 Kenyan shillings in today's economy, accounting for the overtime inflation. But this was just the beginning. You'll be surprised to know that at just 11 years old, in 1972, Uhuru Kenyatta already owned 2,000 acres of Gisheha farm with the title deed under his name. This according to the former member of National Assembly, Kimani Ngojiri.
I have a copy of the title. Yeah, Gisheha, 2,000 acres. You got that title 1972. How old are you to get a title? Corruption.
Tactfully, Jomo Kenyatta in acquiring these lands avoided using his name with merely about 10,000 acres linked to it. Instead, most of the land fell under his fourth wife, Mama Ngina Kenyatta's name, where she was accorded over 284,000 acres, which includes an over 32,000 acres ranch in Kiambu, 2 tea plantations in Matu and Mangu, and 3 sets of farms nearing the Tanzanian border. But how did the Kenyatta family acquire a combined 30,000 acres Gisheha farm, 9,000 acres in Mwiki Kasarani, 40,000 acres in Endebess Rift Valley, a 10,000 acres ranch in Naivasha, over 29,000 acres in Kahawa Sukari, just to mention a few? To uncover this, we have to go far back to 1964 when Kenya became a republic and Jomo Kenyatta was elected the president. Up to this point, most of the land was under the British government. Upon arriving in Kenya, they took most of the fertile lands forcibly from the existing communities, calling it waste and unoccupied land.
And you paid completely nothing for it, just the surveyor's fee.
Yes, let's be honest, it was a fight for survival on both sides. We wanted to keep our land, but quite a lot of that land had been acquired illegally or through coercion, through force.
The most fertile lands then were the Rift Valley and the Highlands, best known as the White Highlands, which would see the Kikuyu and the Kalenjins suffer the most. Fast forward, of course, this would lead to the Mau Mau uprising and eventual freedom from white colonization. From the word go, the main purpose of fighting for independence was to regain land control, as Bildad Kagia told it.
And independence or self-government was only being used as a means of taking back our land. And without land, then everybody thought that we have been sold out.
KANU, as the party in leadership, was ready to use any means, including violence, to regain power and control. This would be the beginning of the communist culture that is dominant in Kenya. However, in a clever way, during the negotiations of independence, the British protected their land rights and set it so that the only way one would acquire land from them was through a willing buyer, willing seller approach, which meant that the land they held would only be transferred to those who could afford it, not those who had been dispossessed. Jomo Kenyatta assured the British that the land under their names would be repossessed in the right way and not in a robbery manner. But still, there was one thing that scared Jomo Kenyatta. He was afraid that after gaining independence and the British leaving, the people who had been robbed of their clan lands would grab them back forcibly, and it makes sense as the only course of action, considering that was the same way that they lost their lands. He had to come up with a way such that it had to be him to acquire back this land for them. So immediately Kenya gained independence in 1963, Jomo Kenyatta facilitated the formation of his secret weapon, the Settlement Fund Trustees. The plan was simple: buy back all the land from the British hands, then redistribute it to Kenyans who had by then been moved to less productive squatters' land. Sounds simple, right? Wrong. This is where Jomo Kenyatta would hit his first roadblock. There was not enough money to buy back all the land, and it makes perfect sense as his government had just been newly elected. He had to find a way to finance their project and make it work. Soon, he came up with the decision to use loans to finance it, and this was a great idea. But again, Kenya was still too young, and finding the whole amount needed proved difficult. There was only one way out of this: get a loan from the British themselves to buy back the land from their own hands. In the first instance, after the independence, a 1 million acre resettlement scheme was initiated and financed by the British government. The Kenyatta government received a 2.8 billion Kenyan shillings loan from the British and a consequent 965 million Kenyan shillings loan afterwards for this specific project. As was the plan, the project kicked off immediately. However, it quickly became apparent that the demand for land by the natives was way higher than had been predicted, and so another land purchase scheme was required. This led to the creation of a new scheme in 1965 and would be named the 400,000 acre scheme. Later that year, in November 1965, the British government agreed to provide an interest-free loan of 2.9 billion Kenyan shillings to the Kenyan government for a 4-year period. However, only 33% of the amount was actually allocated for the buyback project. At this time, over 800,000 acres of arable farmland is still in the hands of the British. For the two projects, the Kenyatta government received over 4.8 billion Kenyan shillings in loans and grants from the British government alone. This was the second highest lender at the time. 2 months after gaining independence in February 1964, Kenya joined the World Bank and its affiliates. 2 years later, in 1967, Kenya already owed the World Bank a total of 4.2 billion Kenyan shillings, most of it facilitated to the agricultural sector. Mind you, this does not include loans in other sectors like tourism and education, which would see it hit over 5.6 billion Kenyan shillings. So by 1967, the total loan from both the British government and the World Bank was well over 10 billion Kenyan shillings. Essentially, Jomo Kenyatta now has a huge amount of money on his disposal and the jurisdiction on how and where the money gets placed. In addition, he has the task to redistribute the successfully bought parcels of land. So back to the main question, how did the Kenyatta family acquire so much land and resources? From the word go, as the president, Jomo Kenyatta had direct information and connection to the SFT and the bodies that handled land redistribution. In fact, there are records of him specifically assigning some of the lands for the building of roads. This influence allowed him to favor the purchase of the land by himself, his family members, and close associates. We are talking about people like James Gishuru, Kenyatta's first Minister of Finance, Mbiu Koinange, Kenyatta's brother-in-law, Njoroge Mungai, Kenyatta's personal physician, and Paul Ngei, who was his fellow detainee and was also appointed as a cabinet minister in the Kenyatta's government. Not forgetting, there was a loophole in the willing buyer, willing seller approach, where with his direct presidential advantage and the already available government funds on his disposal would embark on purchasing as much land as possible as cheaply as possible. There are actually records of the two sons of Jomo Kenyatta, Peter Muigai and Peter Magana, acquiring a total of 468 acres in Ruiru for 70,000 Kenyan shillings when the resettlement plan was still underway. As of 2025, an acre of land in Ruiru falls between 1.5 million to over 100 million Kenyan shillings, all dependent on the location. Strategically, Kenyatta and his family did not always purchase land in their own names. They often used companies, trusts, and other entities to mask their direct ownership, making it harder to track their land holdings. Quite literally, most of the land owned by the Kenyatta family currently was acquired within a span of 14 years, which is immediately after independence. Jomo Kenyatta's appetite for land is comically portrayed in an instant where at one point he almost bought land that he did not know was owned by his youngest wife, Mama Ngina Kenyatta. It was while having lunch with the then provincial commissioner Eliud Mahio in Coast that his attention would be caught by a rather underdeveloped parcel of land, to which he said, as I quote, "Find out who the owner of this plot of land is and tell him I can buy it at double the market price." Of course, Eliud would follow up about the ownership of this land and would be met by surprise to know that the owner was Mama Ngina Kenyatta, who in fact refused to accept the deal set by Jomo Kenyatta. Upon getting this information that the owner of the land was his wife, who was actually by his side as he received the news, Jomo Kenyatta broke into laughter, followed by these words, "This must be the Uhuru we fought for. Even women can own land without our knowledge." 1963 is the year that Kenya gained independence, and of course you know that, but this is the most controversial transition period Kenya has ever seen. This was the easiest time in the history of Kenya to get rich. It is the period that hatched dynasties as we know them today, and it is the period that would see the Kenyatta family own more than 3.1% of Kenya's arable land. The Kenyatta family is arguably the largest landowners in Kenya. Certainly, this has not gone unnoticed by Kenyans, especially during the reign of Jomo Kenyatta's son, Uhuru Kenyatta, where the family's wealth and lands were heavily scrutinized by the public, who called for audits and restitution, but these cries never materialized. The fifth president of Kenya, William Ruto, has also had a fair share of claims that some of the land he owns is grabbed from the public, and here's the video. See you there.